Welcome to the session on contractor management. So the first thing we need to do is look at who we are actually talking about when we talk about contractors. Well, a contractor can be defined as an organization which contracts with a person conducting a business or undertaking to provide materials and or labor to provide a service or to do a job. And a subcontractor can be defined as a contractor who contracts to perform part of the service or job of another contractor's contract. So in other words, we may contract out for someone to come in and build a shed for us, and then they subcontract that out to somebody in to come and say pour the concrete floor. So the contractor will be the person who is going to build the shed for us. The subcontractor is the person who comes in and pulls the floor for that contractor. Now, the thing that we've got to remember is that our health and safety legislation actually assigns contractors as the role of workers when they're carrying out works and treats them as PCBUs when they are directing their own workers. So if you have an individual electrician who employs some workers, right, they are acting as a PCBU for their workers, but then they are also a worker for the person who they are contracting to. And this comes out of the definition of a worker. A worker, and the key points here, obviously it includes an employee, but it includes a contractor or subcontractor or an employee of a contractor or subcontractor. So when we employ a contractor to come and do some work in our organization, then they will be regarded as our worker under this legislation. So what are some of the services we might actually contract out? Well, it might be we have contract cleaners, or we contract out some catering to an organization. So in that particular case, the catering company is the contractor and their workers become our workers when they're performing the catering for us. Maintenance or construction work. It can cover things like labor hire or specialized training providers. Delivery drivers, or it could be a combination of any of those. So it's where we are provided by a service by an organization where we contract out part of our activities who are not our direct employees. They become contractors. But remember, for the purpose of legislation, they are regarded as a worker. Now, services that are provided by major contractors can be relatively easy to identify because generally they are under a written contract and the work is performed regularly. And that might be, for example, somebody like a cleaner who comes in and cleans your premises on a regular weekly basis. They are a contractor, but they are also our worker. Just to remind you of some of the primary duties that are relevant to a PCBU. Remember that all PCBUs, employers or organizations, have a primary duty to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, and that's a key word there, the health and safety of workers at work in the business or undertaking, of workers whose activities are influenced or directed by the PCBU whilst carrying out the work, of other persons is not put at risk from work carried out as part of the conduct of the business or undertaking. A self-employed PCBU must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, his or her own work health and safety at work. So when we bring contractors on, then we must regard their workers as our workers. And remember that a PCBU with management or control of a workplace must ensure, so as far as reasonably practicable, that the workplace, the means of entering and exiting the workplace, and anything arising from the workplace are without risks to the health and safety of any person, and that would include any contractor or their workers. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is relative to as far as reasonably practicable, right? And the duty of care is really as to a matter of control that we have over the contractor or the contractor's workers, right? Do we have contractual control? For example, contract provides instruction and direction as to how the work activity is to be performed. So, for example, under our contract for our cleaners, we may actually define the methodology that will be adopted when they carry out that cleaning and the types of chemicals that are being used by that particular cleaning contractor. So therefore, we are actually determining and directing the contractor and the workers of the contractors, and therefore we would have substantial control in the way they're doing the work, and that would elevate our duty of care. We also have what is called practical control. Whilst there is no PCBU contract, the PCBU has practical control to instruct and direct. So an example might be of that, excuse me, might be a local council who has contracted out somebody to remove something like coconuts from coconut trees. And they've actually defined, whilst they don't define in writing how the person is going to do the work, it is done in consultation with the supervisor who is responsible for the parks and gardens. So whilst there is no written contract, the council is actually controlling the methodology used by the person doing the denutting. So therefore that is practical control, and again there's a reasonable degree of control there, so there will be a reasonable degree of the duty of care. Excuse me. The last one is where we have specialist contractors or occupations. And that's where we contract people for their specialist skills. For example, we may bring in an electrician to do some electrical work. Now, all we would need to do, excuse me, is ensure that that electrician is qualified to do that work. How they actually do the work, we really don't have any control over that. They are the electrician, they're the licensed person in the way they are doing the electrical work. We would just confirm that that person is a qualified person. Now, that might be if we're running an office or a training organisation or something similar. But if we were running, for example, we were controlling an airport and we were bringing an electrician in to do work there, and we have our own electricians, then we should know how they are going to control the work. So it will vary with specialist skills as to the level of control that we would have over them. If we don't have their own internal skills, we might just have to ensure that they are appropriately licensed, such as the electrician or the asbestos removalist. The PCBU still retains duty of those issues over which it has a contractual or practical control. For example, as it says there, license or a safe work method statement. But also, just as a comment, if we had somebody come in to change the lights in an office environment, and that person was carrying out the work in an area where they were carrying out the work above some of our own staff, then obviously we would still have a duty to make sure that that work was carried out correctly and do something about it, so they're not going to drop the lights on top of their heads. So, for example, transport drivers who deliver and collect goods are workers in the terms of the legislation whenever they enter a workplace. The PCBU of the transport organisation and the PCBU of where the pickup and the delivery takes place both have a duty of care to those workers dropping off. And I've just mentioned the electrician who enters a workplace and spends 5 minutes preparing a PowerPoint is regarded as a worker under the Act whilst they're on the premises. Again, how they're doing the work in the actual workplace is what would be our responsibility and our duty, but the electrical work in relation to the PowerPoint, that is theirs, that's their specialist occupation. So some specialist contractors or occupations that you might come across are things like work at height, for example, tripping hazards, emergency procedures, and also risks of falls or hazards around penetrations. They're just specialist areas where we might have specialist contractors come in and do the work. A key component, as I mentioned on more than one occasion, of the work health and safety legislation is that we consult. And it is important that we consult with contractors to ensure that their practices and their procedures comply with work health and safety legislation. We can't simply say, oh, they're a contractor, so they are responsible for their own health and safety, and we've got nothing to do with it. Part of the primary duty of a PCBU who engages the contractor is to ensure the contractor is fully compliant with legislation. And this could be achieved by requiring the contractor to sign a declaration to this effect, or by an induction program for all contractors prior to engagement. So in a nutshell, we have to have some process where we're interacting and consulting and communicating with contractors before and as they perform work in our organisation. So if we don't have a contractor management process in place within our organisation, then an organisation could expose themselves to liability. And these policies and procedures should be in place to identify and manage the contractors when and if they're doing work for our organisation. Now, there is some resources available which will assist us in putting together these contracts. And there's a suite of Australian standards for contract conditions, AS4000, and that is general conditions of contract for use on commercial projects, and you'll see that there are some subcontract agreements there. If you're involved in that area, then it may be worthwhile having a look at what those standards are and what they can do for you. But having said that, we still need to have, if we don't follow those codes to the letter, then we may have to put our own procedures and processes in place. Now, the best way we can look at that is to actually look at what sort of contract categories do we have? What sort of contractors do we have in our organisations? And generally, we can break that down into 4 areas. The first one is a principal contractor or similar. Now, what we're talking about here is somebody who is going to come in and do some major construction works for us. We nominate them as the principal contractor, and basically they're going to put a fence up around the area that they're working in, and they will run their own health and safety within that area. Yes, we still as a PCBU have responsibilities to make sure that they have a work health and safety management plan, safe work method statements, etc. in place, but the majority of the work will be done by the principal contractor. The second contractor is somebody who comes in and does work for us on a regular basis. And that could be someone like a cleaning contractor, a mowing contractor, and generally they have their own acceptable work health and safety management system in place. I'll talk about reviewing that and looking at those in a second, but they have their own health and safety management system. Right? The category C could be the same as B, but it does not have an acceptable work health and safety management system, or in actual fact, doesn't have a work health and safety management system at all. Now that may be here in North Queensland. It could be somebody who does things like denutting of trees, one person. They actually don't have a health and safety management system. Might have a safe work method statement, but that's about it. So what they do is they actually work under our, or the primary organisation's health and safety management system. And finally, we have the category which is minor or low risk work, such as, for example, somebody who is an accountant or some very low risk type work where really we don't need a major work health and safety management system in place because the risks are so minor or so low. So those 4 categories are described in your notes. If we're looking at a work health and safety management system, the work health and safety management system should be robust. It should be a system that works. It would be best based on the Australian standard 4801, which is the occupational health and safety management systems, but it must also suit the type of contractor, the activities being undertaken, and the level of risk that's associated with them. So whilst the work health and safety management system should be robust, it should also be suitable for purpose. So if we have a management system that comes in that is 500 pages for a very low risk area, I'd question the value of that work health and safety management system. So in some cases, you might find 20 pages or thereabouts is an adequate work health and safety management system for a small contractor. So they should have a work health and safety management system though. So the next thing we need to look at is how then do we actually manage contractors? We can break it down into 4 steps. So I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail shortly. But the first one is we need to, step 1 is to look at the contract and tender specification. We need to look at determining the work health and safety tender and contract requirements. We need to determine the level of health and safety that is required for that particular task or contract that we're going to let out. Right? Once we've looked at that, then we can look at an evaluation of that tender. Right? And we look at what work health and safety management capacities and systems and processes that the contractor has. We then confirm, once we've awarded the tender, prior to them starting work, we confirm that the documentation, work health and safety management plans, safe work method statements, standard operating procedures, all are in place. And finally, the last part is when they come onto site to do the work, then we manage the contract through induction, implementation, monitoring, and supervision. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So step one is we need to look at what should be in the contract. Right? We would need to talk about any specific organisational work health and safety requirements that are relevant to our organisation. So that might be that we've got a specific requirement for personal protective equipment. That should be defined in the tender. We may allow or not allow certain things to happen within our workplace. For example, it may be that step ladders are not acceptable and people have to use platform ladders in our workplace. That should all be defined in the contract so that the person who is quoting to do the work is aware of any restrictions or costs that they may incur when they come to do the work. It should also state any legislative compliance that we require. It might, generally, it would cover compliance with the Work Health and Safety Act, regulations and codes of practice. But it may also extend to other legislation where it's applicable. For example, emergency procedures. It would define the responsibilities of parties. In other words, who is going to be responsible for what. It would also detail any contractual requirement to develop and submit a workplace health and safety management system or plan. And if there are specific requirements that are required by the organisation, this should be documented at this point. So again, the contractor is aware of what is required of them. Right? The standard of documentation suitable for work health and safety requirements and the management arrangements. One of the things that we come across quite often is safe work method statements in construction sites. And there's often some variance between what standard of safe work method statement a major contractor requires. Now, that is not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's all have different standards. Now, that again should be part of the tender or contract specification. So again, the contractor can make sure that their documentation is going to comply with the requirements of the organisation they're contracting to. Any risk assessments or work procedures that are required specific to the task. For example, you might require a specific work procedure for working at heights. It may also require an evaluation of the potential impact on the contractor's activities may impose on the workforce and members of the public. So it might define, for example, that if we're going to do, say, dredging on a beach, what and how we are going to manage that dredging. How do we run the dredging parks? What impact is that going to have on the members of the public? Any site-specific work health and safety requirements, any hazards or high-risk activities that may be undertaken. The minimum training, qualifications and experience that is going to be required for the contract. For example, if we're going to operate a backhoe or a piece of earth moving equipment, what sort of competency is required for that? Do they require a verification of competency? Do they require a statement of attainment? Exactly what is required in relation to any training, qualifications or experience, particular to that particular contract, not across the board, but to that contract. What level of supervision is going to be required? It will also determine how the work health and safety requirements are to be monitored. Right? There may be a requirement for the contractor to carry out daily inspections and any other general conditions. It might have, for example, that a pre-start toolbox talk must be undertaken at the beginning of each day in relation to the work that is being carried out. So it's at this point that you are actually defining the minimum standards required by the contract or under the contract for work health and safety management. So that's step one. And once you've defined that, you can generally reuse the information in a lot of cases because it is repetitive in a lot of instances. And generally, when I'm putting together a contractor control procedure, I'll actually have a set of standard clauses that would cover most of those dot points. The next one is that we evaluate the tender and award the contract. Now, on the previous slide, we've gone through a number of items that are required. We then use a checklist to ensure that the contractor has come back to us and provided us with the information required for us to ensure that they've addressed all of the items that they've raised, and ensure that the required project-specific documents have been have been supplied. So we need to look at a point in which we define that the person has met that tender requirements, and we generally do that through a checklist or something of that nature. Right? If we award the contract, then there will be a process of obtaining the documentation from the contractor and verifying that that contractor's documentation is correct. And that might include things like getting details of their insurances. It might include details of their safe work method statements, their work health and safety management plans, copies of any safety data sheets, any risk assessments they may have put in place, copies of the way they're going to do toolbox talks. So you verify your contractor's documentation before they start work. Now, please remember that you're not going to do this for every single contractor, for every single project. The level of documentation and process that is going to be applied is going to be relevant to the type of work that is being conducted by the contractor and the level of risk that's associated with that contractor. Now, often what you will find is at this point that an organisation actually maintains a contract register and agreements with contractors, where basically what happens is they've been through a tender process and they may be put on a panel of contractors who have been approved. Seen the documentation, we know that they have the relevant processes in place, their competencies, etc. So they end up on, for the want of a better term, a preferred contractors list. Right? And that may be maintained. So when they're on the list, they're there for 12 months and it is reviewed on a 12-monthly basis. Right? And that is one way that a lot of organisations deal with their contractors. Now, the contracts for supply can range from properly drawn up legal binding documents to verbal agreements. But the essential elements of a valid contract are the intention, agreement, the consideration, the capacity, consent, and any legal requirements. Now, it might be that you actually put something onto a purchase order, might be a simple way of having a legally binding document, or it can be a very detailed contract for the type of work that is going to be performed. One of the benefits of having a written contract is that it's easy for the health and safety advisors to actually access information. In other words, we can determine what are the minimum requirements, what is required, what has been defined. Where they don't exist, then you might have to review some other paperwork if you're looking at a contractor's performance. And it might be things like invoices, emails, minutes of meeting, purchase orders, to see or confirm what was agreed. We can do it through interviewing relevant personnel from their own organisation and also interviewing relevant personnel from the contract organisation. But I would strongly suggest that where possible, we stay with documented information. Minutes of meetings, emails, it could be on an invoice, as I said, it could be on a purchase order. They are still defined contracts in relation to what is required from the contractor. And when we're looking at the actual agreements, things that we would consider are, do the agreements consider best practice relevant to the industry they're in? So if, for example, and I use tree lopping as an example, do the agreements consider best practice in relation to tree lopping? Are codes of practice or Australian standard considered? Do they fall in line with health and safety legislation? So does the documentation we have actually agree with the work health and safety legislation requirements? And are duty holders identified and their duties set out in that documentation? And often you'll see that covered, all of those three 4 dot points. If we're looking at a safe work method statement for some work to be carried out for high-risk construction work, it will tend to cover off on all of those points. So just for example, if we look at some contractor who's going to carry out some cleaning work, what are some of the things that we look for in their procedures and processes? What's going to be cleaned, right? We define what is to be cleaned, the method of cleaning each area, and any equipment that's to be used. What's going to be its maintenance? Does it need to be tested and tagged? Are they going to be using a residual current device? If there's any waste, what's the method of disposal? Right? What are some of the safety issues that we might have in there? Is what training have the actual cleaners been provided? What information is going to be provided for safety data sheets? What use of personal protective equipment is required? That all will be defined in the actual procedures, process, and activities for that contractor for cleaning. And that again will be relevant to the organisation and the risks associated with it. For example, you may have a totally different cleaning contract with specifications in an office compared to a cleaning contract in a hotel or possibly a cleaning contract in a healthcare facility. So your cleaning arrangements and cleaning contracts for your contractors is going to differ from workplace to workplace, risk to risk. You might also have a system where you check the credentials of all new contractors and their work and the currency of their qualifications, and also monitor them and make sure that we achieve a set of standards. So all of that should be included in their documentation. So the next thing we go to is contract management. How do we actually manage the contract? Well, the first thing is whenever somebody comes to our site, they should be put through an induction. Now, the level of induction is going to be relevant to the contractor. Just bear with me for a second. So some of the things that we would include on the induction are what's the access and egress into the workplace? What are the parking areas? What's the emergency procedures and first aid? For example, if we're doing a contract within a school, right? What do we do in an emergency procedure? What do we do if a lockdown alarm occurs? Right? Who are the contacts on site? Who's the fire wardens? Who's their supervisor? Who's going to be responsible for the work that they're carrying out? Who's the health and safety advisor for the site? Do we need any permits for the work being carried out? That also should be included in induction. What are the lockout procedures for the site? So if the contractor is going to work on some equipment, what is the local rules and processes for locking out that equipment to make sure it isn't started whilst they're working on it? What is our PPE? What's our drug and alcohol requirements? It may be zero tolerance. They may also be subject to random alcohol and drug testing. Again, a lot of this information would have been included right back at the start of the contract, but it is also going to be provided an induction for the individual workers coming onto the site to carry out the work. What are the smoking rules? And are there any site-specific hazards or controls that we need to be aware of? Some of the other things we might look at the induction process is if they're coming on site to do any construction work, that we confirm that they've got their general construction induction card. In Queensland, that is a white card or the blue card. Do they have the appropriate license to carry out or conduct the high-risk work? We've had situations where workers have turned up to carry out high-risk work operating, for example, a forklift, and they have simply been a trainee, and you haven't got anyone on site to supervise them. Therefore, they're not going to be able to operate that equipment. So we need to put them through an induction process to start off with. Obviously, when they're on site and we've got contractors operating in and around site, then there needs to be some level of supervision. Right? Again, the level of supervision is going to be determined at the contract stage, relevant to risk and relevant to the work that they're being performed. It will also be relevant to things like what exposure is their work going to place our workers at, our own employees at. What risk are they going to be placing the general public at? What risk are they going to present to somebody, say, in a school, to the kids in the school? So the level of supervision, there's no hard and fast rule, but it has to be determined as part of that contract management. Again, generally, we would be defining that back at the tender stage as to the level of supervision required. It would also define the level of supervision that is required by the contractor. So in other words, who supervises the worker? For example, if we've got a cleaner that is coming into our workplace at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning, what level, we're not going to have our employees there. So what level of supervision does the contract company have in relation to supervising that single worker when they're operating in our premises? We would need to have that information. So we need to also monitor to make sure that the contractor is performing the task as required. Now, we might do that through formal monitoring processes such as inspections. So we might go out and do some inspections. We might do it through daily toolbox talks or pre-start meetings. Right? Non-compliance reports that come through. And there's a whole list in your notes there of the things that we can actually, and processes that we can actually put in place to monitor the contract. It will actually state in some cases the level of monitoring that the supervisor, sorry, let me rephrase it. It will also put in place the level of monitoring that the contractor must have in place. So what do they do as far as their monitoring is concerned? And the same things will apply. Things like inspections, toolbox talks, pre-start meetings, etc. One of the issues that we have is that often with contractors, their knowledge and of work health and safety requirements might be minimal, particularly if they're a very small operator and haven't got the resources to do as much research and develop as much standards as a larger organization might be. So you might find that through the contract process that you can actually improve the contractor's performance and make them aware of the requirements under work health and safety legislation. And that was fairly prevalent in, and some of you may or may not recall, when they built all of the, it was called the Burr project, when they built all of the schools, built new classrooms or new halls, etc. And a lot of money was spent in actually outputting that. Here in North Queensland, what they did is they actually, there was one primary contractor, but they subcontracted it to a lot of smaller builders. And a lot of those smaller builders, their level of work health and safety performance increased substantially because the contractor involved actually provided them with guidance, documents, etc., to comply with the work health and safety legislation. So they can also look at things like identifying areas where improvement is required. For example, it might be through inspections that are carried out, and we see that the workers aren't working the way they should be. So there's a lot of, with contractors for larger organisations such as councils or larger employers, where they're using contractors, they can actually assist their own contractors in improving their health and safety performance and bringing up their standards. I've just been through that. So one of the improvements, one of the benefits to an organisation in identifying the improvements may be there's better communication and relationships with contractors. So therefore, the contractors work better for us. There's compliance with health and safety legislation. Now, I take you back to the original slide, that as the PCB in control of that workplace, we have the responsibility to make sure that all workers in our work comply with health and safety legislation. By having improvements with your contractors, you're going to improve that level of legislation compliance. More efficient completion of work or projects. Obviously, one will be greater safety for workers and others in the vicinity of the work. Continuous improvement of contractor of health and safety management and compliance with the duty of care. So it's in our interest to bring our contractors up to an acceptable standard. And last but not least, we need to look at review and evaluation. We should have a post-contract review. Now, that might occur at the end of a 12-month period. If we put on a cleaning contractor for 12 months, we might review their performance at the end of that 12 months to determine whether we're going to continue with that contractor, or we might give them some positive and negative feedback on their performance over the 12 months so that they can improve their activities in the process of doing work for us. So your review and evaluation would also impact on your preferred contractors register. It's at that point you may make a decision to take someone off the register if they aren't performing to the standards you require. But also on the other side, if they are performing to your standards, you might find that you just continue their contract, just get up-to-date information on their insurances, their licenses, and those types of things. So it is a very important component, is that final review and evaluation. So do we have any questions? Okay, let's have a look at the assignment that we need to complete. So as with most of our assignments, we have some questions that you need to do first, and then we have got a number of, in this particular case, 3 practical activities you must undertake. So we've got a couple, I think in this case we've got 3 questions, quite simple questions that need to be answered. Question 1 is, what are some common professions that are contracted, provided 4 examples? Have a think about your workplace and think of 4 areas that you might contract out work in your workplace. List 3 documentations, pieces of documentation the principal contractor could expect a contractor to have to comply with. That is covered in your notes. And question 3 is, list 3 Australian or New Zealand standards which could assist in an organisation in establishing best practice work health and safety procedures for the management of contractors. And again, in your note under the resources section, you will see that there is some Australian standards there listed which would assist you in putting together your procedures. So in this particular case, there are 3 questions we have to do for the knowledge section. Go back to here. Okay, now, before I go on to the practical activities, I just want to run through this case study. So in this particular case, the best way we can actually deal with an assessment on this is to actually try and look at a practical example of applying contractor management. So in this particular case, we've got a company called Blazing Pavements. It's a medium-sized business with 100 full-time employees, 20 labour hires, and 3 contract supervisors. They have an existing contract to supply and lay asphalt for the local council as part of an ongoing maintenance program, and compete for private work on the open market, as well as supply asphalt to private and construction market. So Blazing Saddles engages. Now, these are contractors that Blazing Saddles actually contracts, right? They've got Tim's Trucks, who works for a fixed $1 rate for cartage of asphalt from the production plant to the road lane crews. They have Baseline Bitumen, who supply the actual bitumen. Heavy Rock Quarries for the supply of aggregates and sand, so those 2 are suppliers. And then they have Mechanical Repairers, a small privately owned business, for the maintenance of all their plant and mobile equipment. The rest of the crew are full-time employees. So we're actually looking at those 4 contractors when we actually look at the assessments we're doing. Blazing Pavements was contracted as a principal contractor. Now, they've been made the principal contractor in this particular case to carry out road failure repairs and resurfacing of a 2-kilometre section of road by the local roads authority. The contract specified the following: the name of the contract, identified road failures were to be excavated to a depth of 220 millimetres and backfilled, etc. The principal contractor for the project is responsible for the health and safety of all employees engaged at the project, and that will be all workers. A traffic management plan was required to be developed and implemented to control traffic through and past the roadworks. So we've now possibly have another contractor that's going to come on board, being the traffic management control company. Road works are to be restricted to the hours of 9 and 2:30, and the local road authority is going to provide you with a dial before you dig services location plan. Okay. So that's just some background information on the case study. So let's have a look at the assessment activities that are going to be required to be carried out here. The first one is you need to identify the contractors and categorize. The contractors that the company uses must be categorized into a hierarchy so that the appropriate risk management process can be implemented. The hierarchy can be any system, however, the final register must clearly specify the high and low ends and what each contractor's rating is and what they supply. So what we're actually looking for here is for you to look at those contractors on the case study, which is here. Again, it's a copy of it, and determine the risk levels that are associated with those particular contractors. Now, quite happy and quite comfortable for you to actually use the categories that we have in your notes. So you can categorize them according to those if you like, or you can use your own category system. So provide a register of contractors, include the contractors in a hierarchy, include evidence of the risk level. So why have you determined that will be a high risk contractor or why it will be a low risk contractor? Include the contractor's rating, include what the contractors supply. Okay, so what is their actual service that they're applying? So my suggestion there would be that you put together a table actually with those 5 dot points in, or 5 columns, and fill it out and submit that as your particular submission. So looking at the requirements in the case study, it lists the specific clauses that would have to be included in the controls going out to tender for supply of the project. This must include the specific workplace health and safety duties that the contractors will have. So again, if you look at your notes, you will see that we actually have a list under 7.6.2 contractor tender specification, which actually details the types of things that would go into that tender documentation. So have a look at that list and see what you would include in the contractors for the outgoing tenders. Also, include any specific duties that you believe the contractors will have. Now, there might be a need for you to go back and look at the duties of a PCBU in the legislation, but we need for you to tell us what duties they would actually have, and that should be defined. So there is some information there in your notes to assist you with that. And last but not least is probably the major part of this assessment is evaluate the contractors. Now, this is actually having a look at the contract documentation that they're going to supply. So it says here, baseline bitumen has submitted a response to the tender, including a work health and safety management plan and a safe work method statement, which are listed below for their work to be completed. A copy of the following documents have been provided. I've mentioned that. You must confirm that the documentation that they have submitted meets the requirements of the organisation. You have access to 2 templates to assist in the assessment of these documents provided by Baseline Bitumen. You have a workplace health and safety management plan assessment and a safe work method statement review checklist. So we provided you with those. Now I just want to run through what we're going to be asking you to do. Okay, so the first one is provide a work health and safety management plan assessment using the supplied template. First document you need to look at is the work health and safety management plan, which is that document there. So there's your baseline document, and it's got a fair bit of detail in it as to what should be included in that. Okay. We also have provided with you with, and it's in a Word document to make it easier for you, the work health and safety management plan assessment, which I will open up. So you are going to do a review. It opens up for me. So here is your health and safety management plan. You are now going to carry out an assessment. So you're going to look at the plan and say, does it include the client's details, including their name, ABN, and address? And you're going to give it a rating. Tick to conform. No, it's non-conformance. And you're going to go through and check all of those items off. It's about 5 pages of them. So you're actually going to work through and have a look at the plan and do an assessment against it. Ticking, giving ticks and crosses where appropriate or not applicable. And you will find some of the information is not applicable. Okay. So moving back to here, and there's your baseline bitumen plan. So you're doing a comparison between those two particular documents to start off with. We then look at the next two documents is we've got a safe work method statement. So we've got a safe work method statement here for working near roads. It opens up. And you're going to carry out an assessment of that safe work method statement. And you're going to do the assessment against the safe work method statement review checklist. So that's your second point. Okay, provide a safe work method statement review checklist using the template provided. So there's the safe work method statement review checklist that you need to go, and that's a 1-pager. And again, yes, no, or not applicable. Okay. So you're going to do 2 comparisons. First is a work health and safety management plan. The second one is the work method statement review. So both of those will have to be conducted. Now, against each of those, I can tell you now there are some defects in those where they're not compliant with the check, with either of the checklists. You are then going to draft up an email or a letter to Baseline Bitumen to confirm the amendments that need to be required or require for them to change to be compliant with your checklists. So I trust that makes sense. So first thing is look at the work health and safety management plan. Using the template, complete an assessment of the work health and safety management plan, then the safe work method statement, using the review checklist for the safe work method statement, and then provide a letter detailing those things that you identified as incorrect or not supplied, and give me those 3 submissions, and that is what is required for that final assessment. All right. In that case, we'll close it down.